All right. We are now live streaming. And I am about to record. All right. Good evening. My name is Carmalitha Gumbs, Councilwoman for District 2 in the city of South Fulton. It was very important to me to actually put this forum together. I know it is short notice, but I thought the climate yielded for us to have a frank conversation about policing and our police culture in the city of South Fulton and in the metro surrounding areas. So I decided to ask some experts to join us tonight so we can engage in organic dialogue to really talk about what's happening in our city and how our police are responding to our community, okay? I will be introducing our moderator for the evening, Mr. Charles F. Coleman Jr. And let me tell you a little bit about Mr. Coleman. Okay, just one second. Charles F. Coleman Jr. is a seasoned civil rights attorney who specializes in EEO law, human resources, and human capital solutions, as well as the support of diversity and inclusion efforts in the workforce. As a former Brooklyn, New York prosecutor turned civil litigator, Charles has extensive experience as a trial lawyer, and his courtroom acumen is matched only by his leadership abilities, which he displays through his community mobilization and civic activism efforts. Charles has appeared internationally on various media outlets as a legal and political analyst, writer, and orator. He has been branded as one of the brightest and most well-respected voices in conversations on law, diversity, civil rights, and social justice. Charles gives public talks to businesses, student groups, and civic organizations on law, culture, diversity, and social justice. Charles began his legal career as a prosecutor in Kings County, Brooklyn, New York, District Attorney's Office. While there, he excelled quickly and was handpicked to join the Specialized Gangs Unit, where he prosecuted some of the city's most dangerous and violent criminals in several high-profile cases. For his effort as a trial attorney and commitment to justice, in 2007, Charles was awarded the prestigious Law Enforcement Appreciation Award for excellence in leadership and law enforcement. Since leaving the DA's office, Charles has transitioned to the arena of civil rights, focusing primarily on EEO law, while helping to provide diversity inclusion support to companies seeking to improve their workforce. In an increasingly growing marketplace, Charles understands how to impress upon executives and senior management the importance of not simply creating a more diverse workforce and inclusion work culture, but how to do so within the appropriate boundaries of the law. So welcome, Mr. Charles Coleman Jr.
Thank you very much, Councilwoman Gumbs. Before I introduce tonight's panelists and we get into the conversation, I do want to say that I am honored to be a part of this dialogue. I think that this dialogue is very important, and I want to really applaud Councilwoman Gumbs for the work that she does on behalf of the citizens in South Fulton, in the city of South Fulton. I had a number of conversations with a number of different people, some of them elected officials, some of them not. And one of the things that came out of the conversations that I was having was, if ever there was a need or a time in our country where we would benefit from the direction and the leadership of a woman, it is now. Women have an innate ability to be nurturers and to understand what it is that we need as people. When you get sick, when you fall ill, you don't typically call for your dad, you want your mother. And that is just because mothers and women have within them the power and the understanding of what situations need in any given moment. And I have every belief that it is with that in mind that Councilwoman Gumbs thought it prudent to put together today's conversation as a means of informing and calming and reassuring and securing the communities in South Fulton, Georgia, of what is going on in their backyard as it relates to our national dialogue of police, and giving them the sense of peace necessary in order to allow space for this conversation to take place and for us to move forward. So I say thank you for that and for that vision and the foresight to put this together. We are at a crossroads as a nation and as a people. Today, we laid to rest the body of George Floyd. And while we pray and hope that his spirit rests in peace, we are well aware that across America, many cities are indeed very restless. There is continued resistance in major cities throughout the United States. It has hit New York, it has hit Chicago, it has hit Detroit, it has hit Los Angeles, it has hit Atlanta. And many of these protests, much of this unrest and the resistance has uncovered some very ugly truths about who we are and what we need to deal with in order to move forward. We have the choice to squander this opportunity as we have in the past by acting as though we can simply wait it out and return to normal, or we can decide to engage who we are in our most authentic ways and begin to have transparent conversation about what it is that we can do as a people, as a community, to better understand each other, to reconcile our differences where possible, and to move forward. It is in that spirit that I am eager and excited to engage tonight's participants. I find it truly remarkable that we have all Black people on today's call, representative of the law enforcement agencies involved, as well as the elected officials involved. I do a number of different talks, some of them televised on media, and I can honestly say that it is rare to see this spectrum, but it is beautiful in that it creates a different dynamic of what this conversation is and can actually be. For those who are new or unacquainted with the demographics of the city of South Fulton is nearly 85% Black. And so this conversation about law enforcement and community and the usual backdrop of race and how it intersects with that discussion has a very, very unique place in this conversation because, as I noted, is part of the vision and mission statement for the police department of the city of South Fulton. South Fulton is uniquely positioned to serve as a model of law enforcement throughout the country. And I think one of the reasons for that is because it has such a highly homogeneous population, which is also reflected in its police force. By extension, the city of Atlanta is also a city that we all know has an extremely high population of Black residents. That is also reflected in larger number than other police departments across metropolitan areas in the United States. And therefore, it too is uniquely positioned to serve as a model. None of this can take place without very candid, very honest, very transparent conversation. And that is why we have the pleasure of our two guests, which I will now introduce for tonight's conversation. Chief Keith Meadows is the first chief officer chief of police for the city of South Fulton. He was appointed in July of 2018 and has over 33 years of law enforcement experience. Since being appointed chief of police in South Fulton, Chief Meadows has integrated intelligence-driven policing as a philosophy. He has also increased the size of the department's gang unit, narcotics unit, and developed an assets forfeiture unit and created a robust crime analysis platform that serves as a foundation for the department and will for years to come. Chief Meadows is committed to developing community relationships, a culture of innovative technology strategies, and absolute transparency. Welcome, Chief Meadows. Commander Kelly Collier is the commander for the Zone 1 of Atlanta Police Department and also has been the chief of what I understand is it the Police Department's Training Institute, Commander?
Director of the Atlanta Police Academy.
Thank you. The director of the Atlanta Police Academy, which we will get into in terms of its value there. He also is extremely accomplished in the field of law enforcement, as you will already surmise by his rank and his accolades. And so without further ado, I would like to thank both of them for participating and welcome you all to the conversation. I think that, as I alluded to in the opening, one of the sort of unique things about this discussion is that when I usually have talks with law enforcement, I find myself having to bring the perspective of race and law enforcement culture and fuse them together. Now, without making assumptions about what you all's individual positions may be on everything as it relates to Blackness, I am confident that each of you is very much so in touch with the realities of what it is to be a Black man in America. And so you all being high-ranking law enforcement officials, it puts you at a unique vantage point in terms of an understanding, number one, the duality associated with your position and how law enforcement is viewed in communities of color, but also the ability to work toward changing that. One of the problems that I have consistently seen in terms of talking to law enforcement, working with law enforcement, having conversations about what needs to change is that law enforcement tends to be one of the very few arenas where I seldom hear an admission or an acknowledgement of, hey, we can do our jobs better. All of us in a professional realm are capable of improvement, but seldom do I hear from law enforcement, you know what, we can do our jobs better. And I imagine that some of that comes from the actual difficulty of what it is to be a police officer and people not understanding everything that goes into that, the judgment calls, the training, the back work in terms of what it is to be prepared. And so many people may take for granted and flippantly offer their own commentary and opinions about that, which only in turn makes people more resistant toward hearing criticism. But because you all are realists, I would like to open up this conversation, given the duality of your experience and your existence as Black police officers and as Blacks in law enforcement administration, and ask the simple question: do you all think, in terms of policing in America, we're going to narrow it down and talk about South Fulton more specifically a little bit later, but do you all think policing in America can do a better job? And if so, generally speaking, how?
So to answer your question, absolutely. I mean, any law enforcement or any profession that says that there's no room for improvement, I think they're fooling themselves. So one of the things that we do a poor job of, well, there's a couple of things that I think we do a poor job of in law enforcement, and that's discussing our policies and protocols publicly. For some reason, there seems to be this hesitancy in law enforcement about discussing those protocols and those procedures. But I have a command staff that's in place, and we challenge each other on our positions. And through that, we expect our police department to evolve from the varying opinions of different people. And so if all of the policies start and stop with me as the police chief, then we're never going to evolve as an organization. Well, I need to take that even a step further and be prepared to talk about those policies publicly and explain to our citizenry some of the challenges that we have in policing and the reason that those policies and protocols are in place, and solicit their feedback also. That's something that we'll be doing within our organization moving forward. I understand the need for people and not necessarily understanding why those things are in place. But at the same time, we want to make sure that we're being as transparent as we can with respect to our policies and making sure that we're getting that buy-in from our citizens. Another thing I think that we could do better in law enforcement is paying a close attention to the mental health of our police officers. I think it's probably one of the largest threats to law enforcement as we move forward, making sure that our police officers are in touch in touch with their emotional intelligence. I talk about having that reset button and being able to train our police officers and giving them the tools that they need to navigate from call to call. I'm often reminded about this one incident where I had this police officer that went to a domestic violence situation. He got into a physical altercation with the husband. After he was able to get the handcuffs on, the wife jumped on his back, and he was still in the mind frame that he was fighting with a man. And so he wasn't really in touch with where he was emotionally. And when I looked at the body camera video, I said, we can't keep him here because, there's no way that you could explain the actions of that officer and what I saw in that video. And then it occurred to me that giving our police officers the tools to make sure that they are in touch with where they are in terms of their emotional intelligence, it's going to be essential to our growth as a profession. One of the things we're looking at right now is mindfulness and resiliency-based training that gives police officers some parts of those tools. And we're looking at other emotional intelligence training that we can give to our people so that they can develop what I call this reset button, where after you have a physical altercation with a man and you're encountering that same scenario, you're able to hit that reset button and understand what you're confronted with at this moment in time. And so those are the sort of things that we have to look at because I saw that as a fundamental failure. Yes, I had to fire that police officer, but I also saw it as a fundamental failure in law enforcement of us not being able to give our police officers adequate tools to go out and navigate their jobs appropriately.
The chief is right. Kind of stole my thunder a little bit there with the policies and procedures. Our policies and procedures need to reflect the values of our community, but not only having the right policies and procedures in place, but having the appropriate discipline in place when our officers operate outside of our policies and procedures. And the chief hit it on the head with the officer wellness. That's one of the 6 pillars of President Obama's 21st Century Policing Initiative. So we have to ensure that our officers are operating at their best so that they can serve the public because we are a public service, first and foremost.
So I appreciate you all's comments. One of the things that I thought about with Chief Meadows was, arming officers with, or providing, I'll say, supporting officers with tools. And I hadn't planned to get to this early, but I will go ahead and talk about it. In many of the conversations that I've had with law enforcement over the years, most of them Black police officers of varying ranks, one of the things that they have said in terms of tools that they have not had has been the support of community in terms of talking to higher ups about what is needed, what's necessary, what is not approved or appreciated. And so oftentimes Black officers, particularly of lower rank, are intimidated by the idea of approaching top brass in areas that will delve into the realm of cultural competency and culture and race, primarily because they're worried that they're going to end up ruffling feathers, being transferred to a desk job or a desk tour, and not necessarily having the community support to protect them from retaliation in terms of speaking out on behalf of their communities. This is not at all a surprise to me that this happens. So I'm not necessarily looking for confirmation. What I am looking for from you all is for our viewers, many of whom, or pretty much all of whom, are very civic minded people. What are the ways that you can encourage community or offer community that will allow officers to know that they have the support of community, or to make their support in that vein visible, so that those officers feel more comfortable speaking up without fear of retribution or retaliation in those instances? What can community do in terms of making their voices heard and having maximum impact, so that those officers feel a sense of protection, support, and encouragement, and they know when they go up and they speak truth to power that they're not going to end up hanging in the wind without, support?
Well, Charles, I said it earlier. Every opinion and every idea in the police department can't start and stop with Keith Meadows, right? And so empowerment and being able to empower our police officers to come up with creative solutions to problem solving is important. I think when I first became a police chief, I went into an organization where everything was top down. Everything came from the chief's office down to the boots on the ground. And that's the way it was. You gave the orders, you didn't question the orders. But I put together a team that, quite frankly, I expect to challenge me on my positions. And I feel the same way about our police officers. I've told our commanders, if you don't have an open door policy today, and your police officers come to me about ideas of ways that they can make the police department better, then I don't really need you. So if you don't listen to them, I'm going to listen to them. And so if I cannot accept the criticism about what they're seeing in the organization, and I'm not prepared to act upon it, then we will never evolve as a police department. And that's the most important thing. Because the people on the streets, the beat officers on the streets, are the ones that see and experience those challenges every day. And so if I am the right type of leader, then I'm prepared to listen. I'm prepared to take what they're saying and either empower them to do it or to solve the problems, or I am prepared to take whatever resources I can to back them up to help them help solve the problem. Now, what I won't do is let a police officer come and just dump a problem in my lap and say, well, what are you going to do about it?
Sure.
So I'll ask, well, you recognize the problem. Now tell me what you expect or how you expect to resolve this issue. Or what do you expect from the chain of command to give you to help you resolve this issue? And so essentially what happens then is that if you have a police department of 250 people, then you have 250 problem solvers that you're sending out. And so that means there are less things that I have to deal with. Every citizen in the city of South Fulton that wants my cell phone number gets it. Councilwoman Gumbs will tell you, I give it out at community meetings. I on Facebook, I'm very active on social media. Whenever there's problems in communities, they'll tag me and post, and I respond as immediately as I possibly can. All of these things go about building a sense of trust and legitimacy in our community, because people are pointing out problems, and then they see our officers responding to those problems, and then our officers feel empowered to go out and solve those problems, without having to always go and wait for orders to come down from the top.
Today, we have, hit it again, but we have a lot of millennials that are on our police departments, and they bring a lot of value to our department. So it's a must that we listen to them. They know a lot more about technology than we do, and they bring a lot to the table. So here we have a very, 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 very open door policy with our officer.
I've been throwing y'all some underhanded softballs so far, so we might get a little bit deeper into things.
Well, let's do it.
It's not at all intended to be controversial, but it is intended to provoke the type of authentic conversation that I think is necessary. Obviously, we're aware of some of the issues that we've seen in Minnesota and throughout the country. There was an unfortunate incident that made national news, especially in the Black community, around two collegiate students, and I believe it was an Atlanta Metro detective, two Atlanta Metro police. And I guess my question is, part of this conversation is about reassurance. And we can't reassure if we're not honest. And I guess what I would like to hear from both of you, and Kali, I'd like to start with you on this one because you do the training. What is it that you believe keeps or has the potential to keep a George Floyd from happening in Atlanta? And is that even possible?
It's not possible, and I'll tell you why. We can write all the policy we want. We can have all of the enforcement we want. But people are people. Some people will operate outside of policy. And what's important is that we deal with those individuals. We're no different than American Airlines or any other company. We have employees that will do things that they shouldn't do and that they know that they shouldn't do. However, it is up to us to recognize that and deal with the issue at hand before it gets to that level, or if we haven't seen it, as soon as it happens, we need to deal with it.
So I'm going to follow up with you before I go to Chief Meadows with the same question about, what would stop that from happening in Atlanta or in South Fulton. One of the challenges I think that communities of color, particularly Black Americans, have when you talk about police and you talk about policing and the culture of policing is the infamous blue wall of silence. And so we have conversations about what it is to be transparent. We have conversations about bad apples, bad employees, people who don't follow policy. And I'm very familiar and understand that that is the case. I'm also of the belief that, of course, all police officers are not bad. Many police officers, the vast majority of police officers and law enforcement engage their job responsibilities with integrity and high standards and the values that are associated with the communities that they serve. Nonetheless, we also know, if we're speaking candidly as law enforcement professionals, me being a former law enforcement professional, we are aware of those police or those members in our squadrons, in our precincts, in our departments, who might be a little bit, we might not feel entirely comfortable about. We might not feel like they fully get it. We're aware that there are people who are in our units who, if we did hear something happen where they acted inappropriately, we would not be surprised. And oftentimes, the culture of policing doesn't allow us the space to give voice to that. And it's understandable because these are people you work with every day. And so I have talked to folks and said, well, a lot of us work with people who make us uncomfortable, but without hard evidence or anything that they've actually done or something that we can point to, we stay silent as well. So it's not necessarily something that is unique to law enforcement. I think the one exception is with respect to law enforcement, particularly in communities of color, the stakes are higher in as much as someone cannot just lose their job, they can lose their life if people don't speak up. So I'd love to hear you all talk about how do you, really do that in a space that's transparent and authentic.
You're absolutely right. It's a profession where someone could lose their freedom or lose their life. So one of the things that we do here in Atlanta is that when we suspect someone of having an issue or maybe made a joke that was an off-color joke, we'll send them back to this academy and they will go through cultural diversity and sensitivity training with the recruits. And what that encompasses is they go to the Center for Civil and Human Rights for a day. They're going to learn about everything in the museum. And so at the end of that tour downstairs, we conducted a training, a class. They take part in the implicit, explicit bias class. After the tour, we discuss religion, sexuality, ethnicity, race, and various other topics. The topics are about stereotypes, discrimination, and racism. We all know that Atlanta is a very diverse city. We have every culture here, every religion, every language pretty much. We have the second largest population of the LGBT community here. We have everything right here to ensure that all of our people are aware of the communities that they will be serving and that we confront any biases that they may have and deal with those biases. We go over stereotypes that some people may have. And some of the training that we'll do, we get the recruits involved and everyone that's in the class involved. We'll put them in front of the class. So like we'll put all the African Americans in front of the class. And we'll say, so what are some of the stereotypes that are said about African Americans? They'll say, we like chicken, we're loud, we're aggressive, we're ghetto, and things of that nature. We'll do the same with Hispanic community. So things like landscapers, Mexicans, we live off assistance, yada, yada, yada. We must be a community that accepts everyone because we recruit from all over the nation and the country as well. We've started recruiting people from other countries. They must understand the environment and confront not only being around people that they may not like or believe in. It's a must that they understand those communities because we have some people that may come to Atlanta that have never interacted with a person of color before. And so we do a great amount of training to assist us and to help combat what you're talking about.
Thank you.
When I first became a police chief, it was in the city of College Park. I spent 30 years in Atlanta before retiring. And one of the things I did was we had regular conversations about race and race relations in our command staff meetings and with our supervisors. And I just asked a question one time. I said, what is our relationship like with our people in the community? And I had one of my police officers say, well, our relationship with the people on the north end is very good. But if we could just get some of the people on the south end to take more responsibility for their community, I think it would be much better. And then I made the comment, I said, well, it sounds like we have two different college parks. And when I got the answer yes from some of the people in the room, I instantly knew I had a problem. Because if they felt that way, then I knew they were policing that way. And so it's really important for us to have those sorts of dialogues internally so that you'll know who you have inside of your police department and make sure that you put strategies in place to monitor those individuals as you go out to perform these tasks every day. And a lot of this goes back to, like we said earlier, it cuts to policy. And so if you're not having those sort of conversations, sometimes you may have someone, quite frankly, in your police department that might be, they might be a racist. But if you're not prepared to engage in those sort of conversations, and some people hide things very well. And so, from my perspective, we try not to get into hiring those sort of people. But as I said, some people are very good about hiding who they are up front, and we make sure that we structure our background and our psychological services and our ability to evaluate these people up front, so that you'll be able to ask these sort of questions and identify these sort of people. I look at what happened in Minneapolis, and people said, well, I think police officers need to be better trained from what I saw. Well, I can tell you right now, what you saw with that police officer in Minneapolis, that had absolutely nothing to do with training.
Sure.
I don't care how much training you gave that individual. If you could keep your knee on a person's neck and squeeze the life out of them, you lack compassion for human beings, right? And so those are the sort of people that you identify. You get them out of policing, and beyond that, if they have to go to jail, you make sure that you work with the district attorney's office in their investigations to ensure those things happen. And so we have to have those dialogues in law enforcement as well as with our communities to ensure that we're able to identify those individuals that don't necessarily need to be in this particular profession.
Chief Meadows, you just talked about the need to have those conversations. And one of the things that stuck out for me in terms of your bio was your penchant for transparency. And
right.
So I will say that from a social justice and community activist standpoint, one of the biggest problems that results from community is we oftentimes develop a mistrust of police because of a lack of transparency.
Right.
And so I applaud you for recognizing the importance of it, but encourage you to, in whatever ways you are able to, continue to make those conversations as transparent as possible with the community so that they understand that, number one, you're wrestling with these issues, that you understand their importance, and number two, that you are serious about addressing them. So I'm glad to know that that's something that, is on your radar, and I hope that you continue to make it a hallmark of your administration. I want to shift gears for a little bit before we go back to the councilwoman and talk about community policing. I think that community policing is a very important key in terms of what it is that we can do to continue to clear the lanes for better understanding and bridge the gap between police and community. And so, because the city of Atlanta is so uniquely positioned in the ways that it is, what elements of community policing are you currently engaged in that are most successful? There are a lot of different aspects of community policing that exist. It is a two-way street between the community and law enforcement, and it has responsibilities that fall on both ends. So my question to each of you is, what elements of community policing do you feel like are working most effectively? And for our viewers on the call or on the stream, what can community do to better support the community policing model and relationship that they desire?
Okay, so I think we need to kind of say what community policing is first so that everyone will know what it is. And it's basically traditional law enforcement, prevention, problem solving, community engagement, and partnerships. It's basically a mixture of reactive responses with proactive problem solving. And what were your basic question? Your basic question, could you repeat that, please?
Number one, what aspects of community policing do you feel like are working most effectively now? And in what ways can the community do more to support that model for you all?
What's working for us now is we've established a positive relationship in Atlanta with the community. The crime prevention aspect of it, creating a safe social environment. We've addressed and reduce the fear of crime, because it's not only the actual decrease in crime, but the perception of crime as well. We've created some problem solvers out there with the community. We work well together with them. We've established a monthly meeting with all of our communities, all of our neighborhoods. And we've gotten a better understanding of the needs of our citizens and their expectations of it.
Okay. And how do you think community, what if there was something that you would suggest to community in terms of how they can more deeply engage community policing to everyone's benefit, what would you say that is? What suggestion would that be?
Having an open mind, working with us, being willing to help solve problems, and just getting involved.
Okay.
So from our perspective, it would be our community engagement, building and leveraging a network of relationships throughout the city of South Fulton was extremely important for us. Being a new city, obviously, we needed to be able to tap into our community and find out how our communities want to be policed. You know, whenever I say that, people look at me like I'm crazy, like, what do you mean how your communities want to be policed? It doesn't mean whether or not we make arrest on this person or whether we write tickets here or whether we write tickets there. Is to find out what values our communities hold most sacred. And then it's important for us to take the police resources given to us and put them around those values. It might be that they want us to reduce crime. It might be that they want us to have an improved relationship with our youth. It might be that they want us to improve the quality of life, or it very well could be a combination of all of those things. And so going out and finding out from our communities exactly what they want and how they want to be policed was extremely important. And so when we were able to get a sense of what that model looked like, then we were able to come back and put some really effective strategies in place. We abandoned our zero tolerance mentality as it relates to crime. We start focusing on that small group of individuals that was creating a bulk of the crimes in our community. And we started some very poignant targeted enforcement, where we started focusing in on those people, not necessarily writing 4,000 traffic tickets a month. It does us no good to do that when our citizens see us write Mama Jones a ticket on her way to court one day, on her way to church one day, and we have this person that's standing on the corner and we know that that individual has been robbing and breaking into folks' homes. And so having those right strategies in place goes about building a sense of trust and legitimacy within our organization. So when our people see us making success in terms of being able to drive that crime down, they'll say, oh, our police department gets it, right? And so through that, people want to engage in the process. And so our community engagement has been wonderful for us. It's my hope that continues and that we're able to even expand on it further.
If I may for a second.
Sure.
Sir, I'm a resident of the city of South Fulton, so I can say that the chief and his team has done an excellent job. I see a lot of the things that they are doing, and I'm very happy and excited. They're well ahead of where I think they should be with creating a new police department. So I've told him that through various channels. So hopefully he's got the message. Did you get the message?
I did.
Okay, yeah, I see a lot of things they're doing with recruiting and now. Just want to put that out.
Well, gentlemen, I want to thank you both. This is a conversation that is layered and complex on a number of levels. And we were able to sort of touch in a number of different directions, but it would be impossible in this time to cover everything that we would like to. Nonetheless, your insight is incredibly appreciated, and I hope gives a great sense of comfort to the citizens of South Fulton, South Fulton, Georgia, and the citizens of Atlanta as well, in terms of their police force and the top brass in their police forces doing what needs to be done on their behalf to protect and serve them. So without further ado, I am going to turn it back over to our gracious host, Councilwoman Gumbs. And again, thank you, brothers, for joining today's call and your wonderful insight. We very much appreciate it.
Absolutely, absolutely, anytime.
Glad to be here.
So thank you, Charles. We do have some questions in the chat, and I want this to be a conversation, but one of the questions, this is the first time I've heard of an asset forfeiture program in South Fulton. Councilwoman Gumbs and Chief Meadows, would you support an ordinance allowing forfeitures only after a conviction?
So
Any thoughts on that?
assets and forfeiture, for us, it deals with seizing the assets of drug dealers and gangs and things of that nature. One of the things that we're trying to do is to create comprehensive investigations so that as we move forward as a city, we're able to tear down criminal enterprises. And I need to stress that we don't just take people's property for the sake of taking folks' property. In all of the assets and forfeiture cases that we've had so far, we've had these criminal enterprises where they've been, for instance, we had a chop shop, 30 vehicles that were found stolen throughout the Atlanta metropolitan area, and they were chopping up cars. Well, in order for us to be able to effectively eliminate those, we have to be prepared to take their assets along with putting them in jail so that even when they get out, if for some reason the system doesn't keep them in, that it's not as easy for them to resume business as usual. I think for us to look at these investigations holistically, when we talk about gangs, when we talk about all of these different things, being able to tear down those criminal enterprises is really essential. So I would not be in support of anything that limits our ability to effectively tear down these criminal enterprises. Yeah, well, that's my position on it.
I got you. Well, I'm going to switch gears just a little bit. And Charles, I want you to join in the conversation. One of the questions that I received from one of the constituents is that, do you think there are significant differences in the way police interact with minorities and non-minorities?
I don't, and there shouldn't be. If there is, then there's a problem that needs to be addressed. One of the things I preach is C-A-R-E, which is care, and that's courtesy and respect every day, and that's courtesy and respect for people you can meet in person, on the phone, or via email. It's every day, all day.
Okay.
So
I had the opportunity to host the Attorney General for the United States at a question and answer session for some chiefs in Fulton County. And one of the questions that I asked was, how does this administration feel about the 21st century policing model that was put into place by President Obama's 21st century task force in 2015? And I was told that this administration does not see a problem in policing, that most police officers go about doing their jobs the right way every day. And by and large, that's true. But to say that and ignore the fact that there are police departments out there that have shown a history of indifference towards minorities in this country is a mistake. And so I repeated my question to the Attorney General again. What does this administration feel about that? And what would they expect to take from this task force? And he repeated his response. If we are going to have police reforms, I don't think that we can expect it to come from this White House. That's not going to happen. And so to say that minorities are treated the same, and there's 18,000 police departments throughout this country, and to say that they're treated the same in each one of those cities and jurisdictions, I think that's a little problematic, because I don't believe that to be the case. And so if you Google the command staffs for some of the police departments right here in the Atlanta metropolitan area, that their departments aren't necessarily reflective of the communities that they serve. And so it's easy to say that we may have a Ferguson, Missouri right here in the Atlanta metropolitan area. And so to that end, I think that it's important to recognize that nationally, Out of 18,000 police departments, you're going to see organizations where you have systemic racism that's rampant through them. You're going to see indifference towards minorities in certain communities throughout this country. And so those are the sort of conversations that we have to be prepared to have. Sometimes when we say that, we're only thinking about our little world, but we have to think about this globally and what that means in a greater context of what we're seeing and throughout this country.
Okay.
I will say that I will commend both Chief Meadows and Commander Collier for how they navigated the issue of race throughout this conversation. I was very interested to see how they were going to do that, and they did it in a very deft way. But I think putting it squarely the way that you just did, Councilwoman, you can't get around it. So you cannot acknowledge that there is systemic racism that exists in America and somehow believe that it is not at all permeated in the industry of law enforcement. It doesn't make sense.
Absolutely.
So there's no way that you can say the answer is no. At the same time, I think it's important that we understand, because we're talking about something that is systemic, that it is perhaps far too simple a question to ask out of context. I think it is important to understand the interconnectivity between systems and why we need to understand that, so it doesn't fall entirely on police. It is by far and away not a question that across America, more white people are arrested than more black people. 70% of arrests in America occur with white suspects. However, the number of convictions for white people are significantly lower than percentage-wise than the number of convictions for black people who are arrested. What does that tell us? That tells us that there is a breakdown somewhere between what is happening with police and what is happening with prosecutors and in the judicial system and how that works. So understanding the interconnectivity of all of those things from a systemic place, from a global point of view, is critical to having this conversation, because the blame in terms of communities of color and law enforcement cannot just fall on police. If you fix police, it doesn't just fix the system. There are a number of different pressure points that have to be addressed across the board in order to really get to the root of systemic inequities in criminal justice.
Right. And you know what, to take that as there was a while back I was studying the arrest rates and like the state of Connecticut. African-American people only made up, I think it was 3 to 4% of the population, but they made up 90% of the prison population.
Right.
When the state legislators there said that we have to do something to drive these numbers down, that tells you in and of itself that there's a problem in the state of Connecticut. And so I think that they've gotten better since that time. It's been, from what I remember, it's probably been about 10 years ago. But we have to look at those sort of things nationally to see if there are problems in certain states. And then the reform has to come from the very top of our federal government if we are to have some.
Gotcha. Another question that came up was about cultural competency training. Is it a requirement for all of our officers in the city of South Fulton or in any police department to have that type of training?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, we put our people through cultural sensitivity training, and we've also sent them to through sensitivity training for the LGBTQ community that was put on by the Justice Department. I think all of these things are really essential to our understanding and opening up those dialogues because we had some very poignant dialogues in a lot of those courses that we had. And so I think it's important when those conversations come up to engage our police officers so that they know what our expectations are when we're engaging various segments of our community.
Okay.
Absolutely. We require it in not only to have the training, but to have the training reoccurring every so often.
Right.
Refresher training. You know, we need to, in law enforcement, we need to cultivate connections, you know, with empathy and curiosity. Empathy being, you know, understanding someone else's experiences and feelings and emotions, and curiosity being the desire to learn about someone or something, and putting those together will really help all of us. And that's what's needed mostly in law enforcement, because we do come across that and understanding someone else's position and why.
Okay, and do you all think that, I guess, media and technology now has kind of heightened police officers, I guess, their behavior? Because anytime I see something that's occurring, we grab our cell phones and we start recording. Do you think the media has really incited our community to always do that? And how
Well-
have officers reacted to always being recorded?
Well, I'll take the media piece and say, for better or for worse, that has certainly, media's willingness to air the actions of officers has increased the willingness of citizens to sort of be citizen journalists, if you will, on the spot. I think that there are pros and cons to that. I think that sometimes it does result in attempts to provoke officers who are being videotaped at the time. I also think that unfortunately sometimes it ends up being the most important shred of evidence that we have in terms of either protecting the officer or protecting the aggrieved. And so I do think that media's willingness to sort of air those citizen journalist accounts has contributed to a greater amount of scrutiny on the officers and a greater willingness for people to pull out their cell phones. And I don't think that we've really figured out a proper balance in terms of the benefits as well as the detriments where that's concerned.
Mr.
Yeah,
Coleman,
but
you're
I don't
right.
think-
It does, at times provoke. However, we must remain professional and not let us provoke us. In 2016, I conducted the initial body cam research for the department. And since then, we've had body cams. They help us to be transparent, open. We have nothing to hide. It tells the complete story. Sometimes you may see just a snippet of what occurred after the officer has had to use force, but all of our officers are required to initiate their body cams as soon as they get the call. So we get the complete story of what has occurred. I'm a proponent of body cameras, and I think everyone should have them. I know it's a cost issue for a lot of agencies. However, they not only do the officers change their behavior, but the citizens also change their behavior.
And I don't really see this as a bad thing, citizens recording and officers having body cams, or even, the media. Now, if they're participating in fear mongering, that's one thing. But highlighting some of our deficiencies in law enforcement, I think that's important for us to come out in a different place on the other side of these issues that we've been confronted with. I say this all the time. If whenever these injustices happen throughout the country, I don't have the luxury of distancing myself from those, and neither does Kelly or any other law enforcement leader. We have to own them. And so it's stressful every time. So it doesn't matter if it's in Minnesota or New York, or if it's in Missouri. It doesn't really matter where they occur. It's seen as police, and it's seen as there's a problem in policing everywhere. And so those are the reasons that we have to sit down and sort of have these conversations, so that we could talk about what we're doing locally, so that we could talk about how we're trying to prevent these things from happening nationally.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I know that of course, we're a new city, and we are really stepping our game up with technology such as drones, the body cameras. But where do we draw the line in balancing freedom of information versus citizens' right to be protected or invasion of privacy? Because I hear that a lot as well, especially with the drones.
Technology is great. And what I tell my people is that it's a tool. But what's even more important than technology is the policy behind the technology. I mean, that's more important than the technology itself. When we developed our body camera policy, I wrote it myself. I had to solicit input from people. There are schools of thought that you turn your body camera on and leave it on throughout the course of your shift. And some people say, well, that's a great idea. Well, is there a possibility that you might surveil poorer neighborhoods where most of our 911 calls tend to come up more so than others, right? Might you come across a person that's the victim of a sexual assault that's not necessarily comfortable telling their story on camera? You see, all of these things are issues that you have to think about when you're rolling technology out. You have to think about how they're going to be perceived publicly, how you're going to design your policies and protocols behind them so that people don't feel threatened by Big Brother watching. And so these are the sort of conversations that we have to have publicly. Most of our communities right now are implementing license plate readers, right? So they're putting that technology out on their own. How do we leverage that as a city to make us a much more safer city? How do we integrate our technologies into what we're seeing in the private sector into what we're doing now? People tend to buy into something that's born out of the community. And so that's why I'm encouraging a lot of our subdivisions to put these license plate readers up, because that's their initiative. And then when we tie into those, then our strategies become sustainable. Anything that's born out of the community is sustainable. Anything that's born specifically out of the police department, chances are our priority is going to change at some point. And so we need to be cognizant of that.
Okay. Kelly, did you, Mr. Collier, Major Collier, did you have something you wanted to add, or?
Yeah, I was just going to add to what Chief said about the cameras having them on, their entire shift. That's impossible to do. Officers have to make personal calls and use the bathroom and stuff of that nature. Some of that stuff is not possible. But to add to what the Chief said about the technology subdivisions, they're force multipliers to assist us with creating solid cases when it comes to arresting individuals and bringing them to the bar of justice. Those technologies really, really assist us and help us doing our jobs.
So it is their discretion to cut off a body cam at a stop, at a police arrest?
No, our policy states that throughout the incident, the officer must have it on. We conduct audits to ensure that they do turn them on all the time when they have a police citizen contact. Yeah, so there are a lot of measures in place to ensure that they are doing the right thing. And so it helps as a training tool when you can look at it, just do spot check and ensure that they're doing the right thing.
So the way ours work in South Fulton, Councilwoman, is we purchased the technology that when a police officer is dispatched to a call, when he gets within a half mile of that call, his body camera starts automatically taping. And so it comes on a half mile before he reaches. And so our body cameras are based on cellular technology, and it has a number of triggers in it. If shots are fired, the body camera goes off. If the officer is lying down or possibly injured, or if he's not in an upright position, his body camera starts taping. I mean, there are a number of triggers that allow for that to happen. And so we make it mandatory that their body cameras are on throughout their citizen encounters.
Okay. Charles, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I mean, I think you touched on the right point. I mean, I think even for me as a civil rights attorney, having access to body camera footage and having that released oftentimes is a huge tool. I just think, of course, policy and how technology is implemented, particularly in the wake of people's privacy and vulnerable communities, and how that can potentially be an area of abuse, is something that we have to be mindful of. I think that we, as a community, have to have a much more sophisticated conversation where we can't just say body cameras yay, body cameras nay. It doesn't work that way. I think we have to understand that there are very intricate dynamics that are part of this discussion, and discuss them so that we're aware of them, and we are aware that there are going to be pros and cons and pretty much every aspect of it. And I think if people are aware and they understand how the technology is being used, how it isn't being used, why it's being used the way it's being used, I think even if you may not necessarily love it or agree with it, you'll feel a lot better as opposed to just not knowing. So the
Right.
transparency piece is really critical.
Okay. Well, this is my final question, and then we'll start wrapping it up with closing from Charles, and then also to our wonderful panelists. What are your thoughts on a citizen review board for police officers? I've heard talk about it, but how do you all feel about it, and what's your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a great tool. We have a CRB here in Atlanta, but there are two things that must occur with they must have power. If they don't have any power, then they're useless. They must be able to access the body cam, the reports, the dash cams from the cars, everything to be able to investigate an incident. Not only that, but they must go through some type of training to understand why police officers do what they do and why they don't do certain things. Because you can't have someone making the decision and they have no idea what they're doing.
I'm like Kelly on that. I had the opportunity. I investigated all of the officer involved shootings in Atlanta for almost a decade. Working with the Civilian Review Board, you're going to have to make sure that you have the right team on that board. And you're going to have to make sure that they have the right degree of power also, as Kelly said. Otherwise, I don't see them being very effective, but you have to make sure that you have the right protocols in place for the CRB.
A critical part.
So they're pretty much deputized, correct?
Everyone is, well, the ones that I've been associated with or been familiar with are structured differently. Some are deputized. I will say that a critical component of that conversation that didn't really surface during our general discussion is the strength and influence of police unions. We haven't talked about that. That has a very unique impact in terms of some of the barriers that comes into play, and in terms of creating a CRB that I'm completely in favor of it, but I think Kelly is absolutely right. It has to be something that has some meat and some teeth to it. And oftentimes one of the biggest obstacles there are the strength and resistance of police unions. So I think that, if that is something that is being formed, be prepared for that fight. Because just my experience is police unions are going to push back as strongly as they can with respect to citizens being empowered in any way, shape, or form around oversight and or punishment or authority of law enforcement. So you have to be aware that that's going to come, and that's going to be an issue for anyone trying to get the wheels in motion for a citizen complaint review board.
The unions are much stronger up north than they are here in the South. Georgia is a right to work state. They don't wield nearly as much power and influence here as they do in states like New York and Pennsylvania and things of that nature. Oh, I trust me, I know. And so it's even the unions were kind of a non-issue when the CRB was established in the city of Atlanta. But certainly, you want to make sure that the rights of your employees are protected as well.
Understood.
Okay. All right. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. This has been definitely some engaging dialogue. I do want to give Charles a few moments to talk about Know Your Rights. And this will be a document that I will definitely send out to our constituents and also share it along with this video to make sure that people understand what we're doing in the city of South Fulton and also in our neighboring cities, because our borders are so close. So I do appreciate you all joining. And Charles, I'll turn it over to you, and then we'll have our officers, the chief and Commander Collier to give some closing words.
Sure. As the councilwoman has already said, I did provide in anticipation of today's talk, using my experience as a prosecutor as well as a civil rights attorney, a very quick Know Your Rights reference sheet for constituents and anyone else who would share it. I'll go through, I mean, it's very basic, and I believe, Carm, you're going to be publishing it on your website or
Yes,
your
I'll
district
send it
newsletter?
out through the newsletter. Yes.
So I'll discuss it very, very quickly. The first one is, of course, we know that you have an absolute right to remain silent. You have the right to refuse to answer questions for law enforcement, and that is rooted in your constitutional right, your Fifth Amendment right against self-incrimination. And so you do have a right to remain silent. You can let officers know that you are not going to be answering questions in the event that you are stopped and questioned. You also have the right to an attorney if you are being taken into custody. If you are taken into police custody, you're being questioned by police, you should be asking them very clearly, officer, am I free to leave? Officer, am I free to go? And if the officer says yes, then you have the right to leave. If the officer says, well, hold on, I just have some questions for you, then your response is, if I am placed in police custody or you're placing me into custody, then I would like to speak to a lawyer. And if you are not placing me into custody, then I would like to be released. I would like to leave. I mean, it is very cut and dry in that way. But if you are being detained and placed into custody, you absolutely have the right to an attorney. I believe this was kind of sort of touched on earlier. You do have the right to record police actions in public. However, you cannot impede the investigation or the actions of police while doing so. So you have the right to record police, but if police ask you or instruct you to move back so that you can record at a safe distance or so that they can continue the execution of their job duties at a safe distance, you have to respect that right. But you do have the right to record. They can't tell you, they can try to tell you to turn your camera off. However, you have absolute right to record them, again, so long as that does not occur within any sort of distance or space that is impeding their investigation. If you are at home and police come to your home, you have the right to refuse a warrantless search of your home, provided that police cannot provide any other circumstance or reason around exigent circumstances, meaning they're not in hot pursuit of a suspect who was just recently run into your home or anything like that. You can refuse police entry to your home, and you have that right absent the presence of a warrant. If you are pulled over in a police stop, you also have the right to refuse police searching your vehicle. Obviously, your trunk, your glove compartment, things of that nature. Those are things that you can easily refuse. But even if a police officer asks you whether they can look around your car, they are going to shine their light in and they are going to go around the vehicle and they're going to look through the window because they are allowed to do that. That is what is called a plain sight search. They are allowed to do that. There's nothing you can stop them from doing that. However, when it comes to digging into, the seat back pockets or looking into, what's under the chair or pulling up chairs and things like that, those are things that you do not have to consent to. And you have the right to say, I do not consent to a search of my vehicle. Similarly speaking, officers are allowed to, of your person, conduct what is called a safety search. That is a pat down. That is a very cursory search of your person to make sure that you are not in possession of weapons or any other dangerous items that could be harmful to them while they are conducting a stop or a search. Beyond that, you have the right not to consent to a search of your person. Now, very quickly, what happens or what do you do if your rights are violated, if these rights are violated? Well, the first thing that you need to do is you need to always be mindful of where you are and who you're talking to, what time of day it is. Details like that matter because as both Chief Meadows and Commander Collier will tell you, if you can essentially dictate what time the stop was and where you were, law enforcement can figure out who it was that made the stop. But nonetheless, it's very important that if you are able to, the details around badge numbers and last names can only assist. Of course, you want to be mindful if you are injured in a police encounter and you believe that your rights were violated, I encourage you from a legal standpoint to take pictures of your injuries at the time or at first opportunity, and to seek medical attention. We were just talking about citizen complaint review boards. Your city, your police department, your law enforcement agencies, they all have methods of reporting what you believe as a citizen may be wrongdoing. Now, the methods of review are all different, and those differ, but they all have channels for reporting these things. So if you do believe that you are the victim of police misconduct, you need to familiarize yourself with those methods and to exercise them and absolve yourself of those of those channels. And finally, to the point of having an elected official on the call, and as the chief sponsor of this conversation, you need to alert law enforcement. I mean, you need to alert your electeds. You need to alert your electeds that what's going on, because they are the people who have the numbers of the Chief Meadows and of the Commander Colliers. They're going to know who to call in order to find out what's going on. You're a voter, you're a citizen in a resident of your county, and so you have every right to enlist the support and the muscle that exists with your public and elected officials, and you should use it. And then finally, of course, it's always good to think about consulting an attorney. You don't always need one, but nonetheless, consulting one can't hurt, because it will make sure that it preserves your rights, and down the road it keeps everything on the up and up in terms of what it is you need to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And like I said, I'll be sharing that with the constituents. Also, Chief, did you want to add anything or close out?
Absolutely. Given everything that we're seeing right now in Minneapolis and throughout the country, I think, as I said earlier, it's important for us to have, meaningful dialogue. The City of South Fulton Police Department is ready to stand front and center and talk with a lot of our citizenry about what they're seeing and how we could go about fixing things and being that model that Charles talked about earlier. I think that's very important. As a new city, we start off with a clean slate. And so being able to put together a police department that could be a model for policing throughout this country, it's not only important to me, but we want to make sure that same message is important to our electeds and to our police officers as well on the street.
Awesome. Well, and definitely thank you for joining us tonight and engaging in this dialogue. Commander
Absolutely.
Collier.
Well, thank you, Councilwoman Gumbs, for having me on. Thank you, Mr. Coleman, for moderating. We must work together to improve our communities, and yes, they are our community. Yes, I am a police commander. However, I'm a son. I'm a father of a Black son first. So fair and impartial policing is extremely important to me. Thanks again for having me.
Awesome. All right. Well, that closes out our meeting tonight. If constituents have questions, I'm definitely sure I will be able to get in touch with all of these gentlemen to make sure your questions are answered. So again, thank you all for joining us tonight. And you can always find this on my YouTube page, or you can also get it in our newsletter. So thank you so much. And y'all know where to find me.
Thank you.
For the people. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Calm for the people.
Let me take this live off.